He dismissed his wife's warning and boarded the midnight train, only to realize too late that some journeys are one-way tickets into darkness. What he saw that night still haunts him, and now it might be coming for you. As he sat on the edge of his bed, flipping through his appointment journal, his eyes scanning the neatly penned notes for tomorrow's business meeting in Enugu. The deal he was about to close could change everything. For months he had worked tirelessly to secure the opportunity, and now it was within reach. But in the dim glow of their bedside lamp, his wife, Ngozi, stood frozen, gripping her Bible. Her face, usually calm and nurturing, was etched with worry. "Ise," she began, her voice soft yet trembling. "Please, I beg you, pray before you leave. Something isn't right." He glanced up, an amused smile tugging at his lips. "Ngozi, you worry too much. It's just a train ride. I've taken it 100 times. Ngozi didn't laugh. Instead, she stepped closer, her bare feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. "You don't understand. Last night I dreamt of shadows, dark figures running beside the train. It was as if..." She hesitated, her voice faltering. "As if something was chasing you." Izzy chuckled, brushing off her fears. "Dreams are just dreams, my love. Don't let them scare you. Besides, I don't have time for all this pray before you go talk. The train leaves in less than an hour." She reached out, clutching his arm. Her grip was firmer than he expected. "Promise me you'll pray." As he sighed, his patience thinning. "Ngozi, I appreciate your concern, but there's nothing to worry about." He kissed her forehead, grabbed his well-worn suitcase, and walked to the door. "I'll see you in 2 days. Keep the faith, eh?" Ngozi watched him leave, her heart heavy. Something deep inside whispered that this was no ordinary trip. "Lord," she whispered as tears streamed down her face, "please protect him. Let him come back to me." Outside, the air was cool, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. As he walked briskly toward the main road, his mind already consumed with thoughts of the deal ahead. But as he stepped into the waiting taxi, a strange sensation prickled the back of his neck, a fleeting sense of being watched. The train station was quieter than Ise expected for a bustling Lagos evening. Usually travelers jostled for space. Vendors shouted prices for roasted plantains and sachets of water, and taxi horns blared incessantly in the background. But tonight, the station seemed eerily subdued. Ise stepped out of the taxi, adjusting his jacket against the cool night breeze. He surveyed the scene. A few passengers sat on scattered benches, their faces blank and distant, while others paced slowly, their footsteps unnaturally muted. Even the usual cacophony of vendors and beggars seemed absent. At the platform, an elderly woman with a wide-brimmed hat rocked back and forth, mumbling to herself. Her lips moved rapidly, forming words Eze couldn't hear, though her voice carried an unsettling cadence. He shook his head, dismissing her as another eccentric among the Lagos crowd. The train whistle blew, its sound echoing through the still night. Eze checked his watch, 5 minutes to midnight. As he walked toward the third carriage, dragging his worn suitcase behind him, he caught sight of a young man leaning against a pillar. The man's eyes darted around nervously, as if searching for someone or something. Eze shrugged off the unease creeping into his thoughts. "It's just the lateness of the hour," he muttered under his breath. He handed his ticket to the conductor, a man with an unusually pale complexion and a stiff demeanor, who barely glanced at him before waving him aboard. Inside the carriage, the atmosphere was oddly stifling despite the air conditioning. Only a handful of passengers were seated, most of them avoiding eye contact. Eze chose a window seat near the middle, tossing his suitcase onto the rack above. The rhythmic hum of the engine starting up soothed him, and he leaned back, resting his head against the seat. The train jerked into motion, pulling away from the station. Through the window, the city lights receded, replaced by the dark, sprawling countryside. Eze watched the landscape blur past, his thoughts drifting back to the lucrative deal awaiting him in Enugu. Yet, no matter how much he tried to focus on his plans, he couldn't shake the weight of his wife's words. "I dreamt of shadows," Ngozi had said, her voice trembling. Her plea played over and over in his mind, like a melody he couldn't forget. A faint chill ran down his spine as he glanced around the carriage. The other passengers sat unnervingly still, their faces hidden in the flickering light. He adjusted his seat and closed his eyes, hoping to snatch some rest before morning. But as the train rumbled on, that strange sense of unease only grew stronger. As the train picked up speed, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels filled the air, but it did little to mask the strangeness that hung like a fog inside the carriage. Eze looked around, hoping to make small talk with a fellow passenger to shake off the unsettling silence. Yet no one seemed approachable. Directly across the aisle sat a middle-aged man in a faded agbada. His head was bowed, and he muttered under his breath, his words inaudible yet relentless. A young woman with braided hair sat a few seats ahead, her posture rigid, her face turned toward the window as if she were watching something. Eze cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Excuse me," he said to the man across the aisle. "Do you have the time?" The man stopped muttering and lifted his head, revealing a face drenched in sweat despite the cold interior. His lips curled into a strained smile that didn't reach his eyes. Without answering, he resumed his muttering, his hands trembling in his lap. Eze leaned back in his seat, uneasy. He turned his attention to the window, hoping the passing scenery might calm him. Outside, the landscape had changed dramatically. The train now sped through a dense forest, the trees tall and twisted, their branches almost clawing at the night sky. There were no stars, only the faint glow of the moon, partially obscured by dark clouds. The young woman ahead turned suddenly, her wide eyes meeting Eze's. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the stillness like a knife. "Stay awake," she said. "What?" Eze asked, confused. "Stay awake," she repeated, her voice trembling. Before he could respond, she turned back to the window, her hand gripping the armrest tightly. Eze's chest tightened as unease gripped him. He looked down at his watch, but the face was blank, its hands motionless. He tapped it a few times, frustrated, but the watch remained dead. The whispers returned, faint at first, rising and falling like a distant chant. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What is this?" Ez muttered to himself, gripping his seat. He felt a strange pull to look back toward the end of the carriage, but something deep within him screamed not to. Ez tried to distract himself by focusing on the rhythm of the train, but even that seemed off, staggered and uneven, as though the train's machinery were struggling against an unseen force. His thoughts drifted back to Ngozi's plea, and a pang of guilt twisted in his chest. The woman ahead whispered something again, but this time it wasn't to him. She seemed to be speaking to herself or perhaps someone unseen. Eze tried to ignore it, but the muttering around him was growing louder, joined by faint sounds from the ceiling, scratches, as if claws were dragging across the metal. "I need to stretch my legs," Eze muttered to himself, rising from his seat. He steadied himself as the train rocked slightly and made his way toward the end of the carriage. The air grew colder as he moved, and the flickering lights above dimmed further. The last few rows were empty, yet he could have sworn he'd seen someone sitting there when he first boarded. A shiver ran down his spine, and he turned back toward his seat. Suddenly the train lurched violently, throwing him against a row of seats. "What was that?" he gasped, his heart pounding. The old man in the agbada began to laugh softly, the sound low and guttural. The young woman's whispers became frantic. Outside, the dark forest grew thicker, and shadows danced unnaturally across the windows. Ez returned to his seat, his mind racing. Something about this train wasn't right. He considered calling someone, anyone, but his phone wouldn't turn on, and the signal bars were non-existent. The whispers had intensified, morphing into a strange cadence that tugged at his thoughts. He looked at the man across the aisle again, but this time the man was completely still, too still. His chest didn't rise or fall, and his eyes stared blankly at the floor. Eze leaned closer, a growing sense of dread making his movements sluggish. "Sir?" he called softly. The man's head jerked up abruptly, and Eze recoiled. The man's eyes glowed faintly, their whites replaced by an unsettling luminescence. "Pray," the man rasped, his voice cracking. "Pray now, before it's too late." Eze stumbled back into his seat, his pulse hammering. The man slumped forward again, as if lifeless. Eze turned to the young woman ahead, hoping for some kind of explanation, but she remained motionless, her face hidden by her braids. He pressed his hands against his face, taking deep breaths. "This can't be real," he muttered. But as he opened his eyes, a dark shape darted across the aisle, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Eze sat frozen in his seat, his breathing shallow as he tried to make sense of what he had just witnessed. The man across the aisle hadn't moved since his chilling declaration. His glowing eyes and raspy voice replayed in Eze's mind like a haunting melody. He needed answers, but from whom? The young woman ahead? The lifeless man across the aisle? Every instinct in his body screamed that something wasn't right. His gaze darted toward the other end of the carriage, where faint murmurs drifted toward him. As he strained to listen, he noticed something odd about the sound. It wasn't coming from the passengers. The whispers were coming from above. He glanced upward, the overhead lights flickering with every passing second. Scratches, faint but unmistakable, echoed across the ceiling. He leaned closer to the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of what lay outside. The twisted forest remained a dark blur, but for a fleeting moment he thought he saw a figure running alongside the train. It was cloaked in shadow, its shape unnatural and distorted. "Stay awake," came a voice, low and trembling. Eze turned sharply to see the young woman standing beside him. Her eyes darted toward the ceiling. "They come for those who sleep." "What are you talking about?" he whispered, his voice shaking. She stepped closer, her hands trembling as she clutched a leather-bound notebook to her chest. "You shouldn't have boarded this train. None of us should have." Her voice was barely audible, her words laced with fear. "Who are you?" Eze demanded, his frustration and fear boiling over. "What is this place?" Before she could respond, the train groaned, and the lights above dimmed further. The whispers grew louder, no longer soft, but filled with an eerie cadence that seemed to speak directly to his mind. "It's starting," she said, her voice trembling. Without another word, she hurried back to her seat, leaving Ez alone with his mounting terror. The train sped deeper into the dark forest, the twisted trees forming an almost impenetrable wall on either side of the tracks. Eze pressed his face to the window, scanning the dense shadows. The figure he thought he had seen earlier was gone, but the unease it left behind lingered like a chill in the air. Ahead, the tracks gleamed faintly in the moonlight. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to relax. Maybe his imagination was playing tricks on him. Maybe the strange passengers were just eccentric, and he was reading too much into their behavior. But as the train approached a bend, he saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures stood motionless on the tracks ahead, their forms barely discernible from the darkness that surrounded them. Their heads tilted unnaturally, and their limbs seemed elongated, stretched beyond what should have been possible. Ez's heart raced as the train barreled toward the figures, yet they didn't move. Just as the train was about to collide with them, they vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. He gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles white. "Did you see that?" he asked aloud, but no one answered. The passengers around him sat stiffly, their faces blank and their eyes unfocused. It was as if they hadn't seen anything at all. The train's whistle pierced the air, long and mournful. Easy's eyes remained fixed on the tracks ahead, even as the shadowy figures began to reappear along the edges of the forest, running alongside the train like silent predators. Back in Lagos, Ngozi sat cross-legged on the living room floor, her Bible open before her. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering light of a single candle. She had been praying for hours, her voice hoarse from repeating the same plea. "Lord, protect my husband, bring him home safe." Her chest felt heavy, a deep ache that wouldn't go away. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flashes of darkness, twisted trees, shadowy figures, and Iza's terrified face. The visions had started as faint impressions, but now they were vivid and unrelenting. A soft knock at the door startled her. She rose, opening it to find their neighbor, Mama Chinyere, holding a steaming bowl of pepper soup. "Ngozi, my daughter, you've been praying for hours. Eat something. You need your strength." Ngozi shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "Mama, I feel something terrible is happening to Isa. I can't stop praying." Mama Chinyere sighed and placed the bowl on the table. "Faith is good, my daughter, but don't forget to care for yourself. The Lord will hear you." She paused, her gaze softening. "But if your spirit tells you to keep praying, then pray. Don't stop." As Mama Chinyere left, Ngozi knelt again, clutching the rosary in her hands. The visions returned stronger than ever, a blinding light, a broken bridge, and Ise calling out her name. Her heart pounded as she whispered through her tears, "Lord, please, don't take him from me. Don't take him." The train slowed slightly, and Ise noticed a woman standing in the aisle, her back to him. She wore a long black dress, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Something about her felt out of place, as though she didn't belong on this train, or anywhere at all. She turned and caught him staring. Her lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes held no warmth. She walked slowly toward him, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "You're not like the others," she said, her voice smooth and calm. "Excuse me?" Eza asked, his brows furrowing. "You don't belong here," she continued, tilting her head slightly. "This train, it's not for people like you." "What do you mean?" Eze demanded, his patience thinning. "Where is this train going?" The woman smiled again, but it was unsettling. "The same place all trains like this go. You'll see soon enough." Before he could press her for more, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the next carriage. Ez rose to follow her, but the whispers returned, louder than before, rooting him to the spot. He sat back down, his chest tight with fear and confusion. Ez leaned back in his seat, his body tense and his mind swirling with unanswered questions. The woman's cryptic words replayed in his head. "This train, it's not for people like you." His instinct screamed for him to get up, to find the conductor, to demand answers. Yet he couldn't move, paralyzed by an unseen force that seemed to weigh him down. Exhaustion clawed at him. his eyelids heavy despite the fear coursing through his veins. The rhythmic clatter of the train, unsettling moments ago, now felt hypnotic. As his head tilted back against the seat, and he slipped into an uneasy sleep. In the dream, as he found himself standing on the train tracks, the forest loomed around him, its twisted branches swaying as though alive. The train was in the distance, stationary but breathing. Its engine emitted deep guttural sounds like a slumbering beast. The windows glowed faintly, though no passengers were visible inside. "Eze," called a familiar voice. He turned to see his father, standing just a few feet away. His father's face was stern, his eyes filled with urgency. "Papa," Eze stammered, "what are you doing here? You've been gone for—" "Listen to me, Eze," his father interrupted. His voice was calm but carried an edge that sent shivers down Eze's spine. "This is no ordinary train. It's taking you somewhere you don't want to go." Eze stepped closer, his heart pounding. "What do you mean? I don't understand." "You must pray," his father said, his voice rising slightly. "Pray now before it's too late. It's the only way to stop what's coming." Before Eze could respond, the ground beneath him shook violently. He turned to see the train's engine roaring to life, its lights glowing brighter as it charged toward him. He tried to move, but his legs felt rooted to the tracks. The train's whistle screamed, a deafening sound that tore through the night. Eze woke with a gasp, his heart racing and sweat pouring down his face. He looked around the carriage, his vision blurred and his mind disoriented. The train was still moving, the forest outside unchanged. But something was different. The passengers were gone. Every seat around him was empty. The man in the agbada, the young woman, the cryptic lady in black, none of them were there. Even the carriage itself seemed altered, the walls stretching unnaturally, the lights dimming to an eerie orange hue. Eze clutched the armrests, his breathing shallow. "This isn't possible," he thought. He rose to his feet and called out, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The only answer was the sound of the train and the faint, ever-present whispers. Ez felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to look out the window. His heart sank as he did. Thank you for watching and diving into this journey with us. Be sure to catch the next episode, and if this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more captivating African tales. Don't forget to tap the notification bell to stay inspired and connected to the wisdom and heart of these stories. Until next time, stay blessed and keep shining.